But to understand the mystery of that night, we must first understand the quiet, creeping dread that preceded it. The year is 1773. For a decade, a storm had been brewing between Great Britain, the most powerful empire on earth, and its 13 American colonies. It was a quarrel about many things, about liberty, about representation, about the very nature of power. But on the surface, it was a quarrel about something far more mundane, and yet, in its own way, far more potent. It was a quarrel about tea. Now, tea was more than a drink. It was the lifeblood of social life in the colonies. It was sipped from delicate china in the parlors of the wealthy and boiled in iron pots in the kitchens of farmers. It was a comfort, a ritual, a symbol of civility in a world that could often be harsh and uncertain. And for the British East India Company, it was a matter of life and death. This company was not just a business. It was a behemoth, a state within a state, with its own army and its own dominion over an entire subcontinent, India. But in 1773, this giant was stumbling. It was drowning in debt and sitting on £18 million of tea it couldn't sell. A great deal of this tea was spoiling in London warehouses. The company was, to put it simply, too big to fail. The British government, heavily invested in the company's success, had to act. Their solution was the Tea Act of 1773. And here is where the first great misunderstanding of our story begins. The Tea Act was not a new tax. The colonists had been furious about taxes before, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, but this act actually lowered the price of tea. It allowed the East India Company to ship its tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen in England, and sell it through its own chosen agents. This meant that even with a small, existing tax, the 3 pence per pound Townshend duty still in place, the company's tea would be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that most colonists drank. So, why on earth would anyone be angry about cheaper tea? This is the heart of the mystery. To the British Parliament, it was a clever, elegant solution. They were throwing a lifeline to a troubled corporation, and as a bonus, giving the colonists a price break. They expected cheers. Instead, they got a firestorm. The colonists, you see, saw not the price, but the principle. They perceived the act as a devious trap. If they bought this cheap tea, they would be quietly, almost unconsciously, accepting Parliament's right to tax them. It was the thin end of a very dangerous wedge. The tax itself was small, but the power it represented was immense. As John Dickinson had written years before, those who are taxed without their own consent, expressed by themselves or their representatives, are slaves. And there was another, more immediate problem. The Tea Act created a monopoly. It cut out the colonial merchants, the very men who were the loudest voices of protest. These were not radicals living on the fringes, they were the wealthy, the influential, the ship owners and traders of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Men like John Hancock, whose own fortune was built partly on smuggling tea. Now, the British government was handing their business to favored consignees, many of whom were connected to the royal governors. It was an economic attack on the colonial elite, and it galvanized them into action. The call went out, the tea must not be landed. In Philadelphia and New York, mass meetings pressured the tea agents to resign. Ships carrying the hated leaves were turned back before they could even dock. But in Boston, the situation was different. The royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was a man of principle and intelligence, but he was also stubborn. His own sons were among the consignees appointed to receive the tea. For him, this was not just a matter of imperial policy, it was personal. He was determined that the tea would land, that the law would be obeyed. And so, in late November of 1773, the first of 3 ships, the Dartmouth, sailed into Boston harbor. It was followed shortly by the Eleanor and the Beaver. They sat at Griffin's Wharf, their holds filled with 340 chests of tea, worth a small fortune. And there they sat, under the watchful eyes of the townspeople. For nearly 3 weeks, Boston became a city under a kind of peaceful siege. Mass meetings were held, the largest at the Old South Meeting House, a church that became the parliament of the people. Thousands of men crowded into its pews and galleries, the air thick with tension and the smell of wool and wood smoke. They passed resolution after resolution, demanding that the ships be sent back to England, their cargoes untouched. Samuel Adams, the master of political organization, guided these meetings with a steady hand, his every word a kindling for the fire of resistance. But Governor Hutchinson, from his country house in Milton, refused to budge. He saw the mob rule in Boston and was determined to uphold the dignity of the crown. He issued orders that no ship would be allowed to leave the harbor without a pass, and he would grant no passes until the tea was unloaded and the duty paid. The law was clear: if the tea was not landed within 20 days of the ship's arrival, it would be seized by customs officials and sold at auction anyway. For the Dartmouth, that deadline was midnight on December 16. The clock was ticking. The city held its breath. Imagine the scene: the cold December days, the ships creaking gently at their moorings, their hatches sealed. Armed men, appointed by the town meetings, kept a constant watch to ensure that not a single chest was removed. The wharves were crowded with onlookers. Riders carried news to and from the other colonies. All of America was watching Boston. December 16 dawned cold and clear. It was a Thursday. That morning, a final, desperate mass meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House. It was the largest yet. The atmosphere was electric, a strange mixture of grim determination and religious fervor. Speaker after speaker addressed the crowd. A young man named Josiah Quincy Jr. gave a fiery oration, warning of the dreadful alternative that lay before them. A messenger was sent to Governor Hutchinson at Milton, bearing one last request: allow the ships to leave, and the crisis would be over. The crowd waited. The winter sun began to sink, casting long shadows through the church's clear glass windows. The meeting dragged on. People prayed, they debated, they grew restless. The candles were lit. The tension was a physical thing, a weight on every heart. Finally, around 6 o'clock, the messenger returned. He pushed his way through the throng and climbed to the pulpit. In the hush that fell, his voice rang out, sharp and clear: Governor Hutchinson says the ships cannot leave until they are unloaded, and he will use the power of the king to enforce the law. The news was like a spark in a powder keg. A great shout of anger and frustration went up from the crowd. Men leaped to their feet. And then, from the back of the church, a voice cried out. Some say it was the voice of a cooper, a barrel maker, or perhaps a man named Samuel Adams himself. The voice roared, "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight. The Mohawks are come." It was the signal. A group of men, perhaps 100 or more, had been waiting outside. They had prepared. Many daubed their faces with soot and lampblack, or smeared themselves with red ochre and grease, disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians. It was a deliberate choice, a piece of political theater. It was a way of saying, we are no longer British subjects, we are Americans, children of this new land. It was also a mask of anonymity, a shield against identification and prosecution. As the meeting at the Old South dissolved into a controlled chaos, a war whoop, practiced and eerie, cut through the cold night air. The disguised men, followed by a great crowd of onlookers, streamed down the dark streets toward Griffin's Wharf. The moon was just past its first quarter, offering a silvery, uncertain light. The wharf was eerily quiet when they arrived. The crews of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver were taken by surprise. There was no resistance. The ship's masters were only too happy to cooperate, perhaps even secretly relieved. The Mohawks worked with a speed and discipline that was breathtaking. They were divided into 3 parties, one for each ship. They knew exactly what they were doing. Many of them were sailors and shipyard workers by trade, men who knew the rigging and the holds of these vessels better than anyone. They demanded the keys to the holds from the ship's captains. They then went below decks, hoisted the heavy chests, each weighing several hundred pounds, up to the deck. Using tackles and block and tackle, they swung the chests over the rail. And then, with a swift, brutal motion, they used their tomahawks to smash the lids. The tea, the fragrant, precious, and now hated leaves, cascaded into the dark water of the harbor. The chests were made of wood and bound with iron, and they did not sink immediately. The men had to work quickly, breaking them open and shaking out the contents, ensuring the tea was destroyed and could not be salvaged. A thick, pungent aroma filled the cold night air, the smell of brewing revolution. The work was done in a profound and purposeful silence, broken only by the thud of axes, the scrape of chests on wood, and the gentle splash of tea hitting the water. There was no looting. One man was seen trying to pocket a bit of tea for himself, and he was immediately stripped of his booty and roughly handled. This was not a riot, it was an act of deliberate, defiant protest. They were destroying property to make a point, a dangerous and radical idea. On the shore, a vast, silent crowd watched. They didn't cheer. They stood as witnesses, their presence a form of consent. The whole operation took nearly 3 hours. By the time the Mohawks were done, 340 chests of tea lay ruined in Boston Harbor. 92,000 pounds of tea. In today's money, the loss would be well over $1 million. When the last chest was smashed and the last leaf had sunk from sight, the Mohawks quietly vanished back into the city. They melted away into the night, wiping the soot from their faces and returning to their homes, their shops, their farms. They left behind only the 3 silent ships, the debris floating on the tide, and the heavy, cloying scent of tea in the air. The next morning, as the sun rose over a stunned and quiet Boston, the scale of what had happened began to dawn on everyone. Paul Revere, the silversmith and express rider, rode south, carrying the news to New York and Philadelphia. The reaction was mixed. Some were elated. John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States, wrote in his diary, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity, in this last effort of the patriots, that I greatly admire." But others were horrified. In London, the news was met with outrage. The government of Lord North was stunned and enraged. This was not a political protest anymore, this was an act of mass destruction of private property, an assault on the very concept of law and order. They saw it as the work of a lawless mob that had to be crushed. Parliament passed a series of punitive acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The Charter of Massachusetts was radically altered. Royal officials accused of crimes would be tried in England. And troops were quartered in private homes. These acts, intended to isolate and punish Boston, had the opposite effect. They united the colonies as never before. They led directly to the convening of the First Continental Congress, a gathering of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies to coordinate a response. They set in motion the chain of events that would, just 18 months later, lead to the first shots being fired at Lexington and Concord. And so, the mystery of that night endures. We know what happened, but we still wonder about the who. Who were those Mohawks? Many men carried the secret to their graves. We know some of the names now, from letters and diaries revealed long after the Revolution was won. Men like Paul Revere himself, the silversmith, John Hancock's apprentice, and a young man named Samuel Sprague, who would go on to fight in the war. But the full list will never be known. They chose to be anonymous, to be a symbol, not individuals. They became, in a way, the first anonymous Americans. But the greater mystery is the mystery of consequence. On that cold December night, a group of men, disguised and determined, threw a fortune into the sea. They didn't know they were starting a war. They didn't know they were forging a nation. They only knew they were making a stand, a desperate, defiant, and irrevocable stand. They turned a simple act of destruction into a statement so powerful that its echoes have not faded to this day. The Boston Tea Party was many things, an act of rebellion, a crime, a piece of brilliant political theater, a desperate gamble. But above all, it was a story. A story that Boston told itself, and then told the world. A story of how a handful of men, with their faces blackened and their purpose clear, changed the course of history by the light of the moon. Friends, if you are interested in the true history of the United States without embellishment, subscribe to the Empire of Freedom channel. Click on the bell so you don't miss anything.